Genesis chapter 17. I want to look at just a few things that we've already been through pretty quick to prepare us for Genesis 22, which is where we'll start in a little bit. I want to remind you of the specific promises that God has given to Abraham, some things that God has specifically told Abraham in the years gone by. Specifically here in Genesis chapter 17, look at these first 5 verses. Now, when Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abram and said to him, now, Lord, all caps, covenant God, Yahweh, relationship. He says, I am God Almighty, walk before me and be blameless. And of course, this God Almighty is the El Shaddai, which should always stir us to remember He is the one who keeps His promises. He is the overpowerer. That's why it uses the term Almighty. So often people use terms like Almighty whenever they're actually inferior to something. All of a sudden they talk about some almighty team and then they get completely blown out. You're like, not so almighty now. But you look at what's going on here, and for Abram, for God to introduce Himself this way with this kind of terminology and title should tell Abram something in particular. There is nothing that is out of bounds for God to have the power to do, especially since He's going to promise something. Then He says, I am God Almighty, walk before me and be blameless. Verse 2, I will establish my covenant between me and you, and I will multiply you exceedingly. Now, here's Abram, family, very small. If you notice through the things here, Hagar's given birth to Ishmael, the chapter before, and to go, things are still relatively small, especially with Sarah in mind. Then, verse 3, this turns Abram to want to worship. He fell on his face, and God talked with him, saying, as for me, behold, my covenant is with you, and you will be the father of a multitude of nations. No longer shall your name be called Abram, but your name shall be Abraham, for I will make you the father of a multitude of nations. Anytime Abram gets called Abraham in the future, there should always be a reminder, because this is the name change. A reminder that God is the overpowerer. No matter what the situation, no matter what He's being asked to do, He knows God will always keep His promises without fail. Then, look down a little bit further in chapter 17. Look at verse 15. Then God said to Abraham, and of course He's always going to be referred to as Abraham from here on out through Genesis. Then God said to Abraham, as for Sarai your wife, you shall not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name. I will bless her, and indeed I will give you a son by her. Then I will bless her, and she shall be a mother of nations. Kings of peoples will come from her. What do you notice specifically being promised here by God? You're going to have a son, and that son is specifically going to come through who? Through Sarah. This is not going to be some surrogate child. This is not going to come from some handmaid. This is going to come right from the womb of Sarah. Then, verse 17. He says, then Abraham fell on his face and laughed and said in his heart, will a child be born to a man 100 years old, and will Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child? He's like, are you kidding? At the same time, who's he talking to? The El Shaddai, the God Almighty. Then, verse 18, Abraham said to God, oh, that Ishmael might live before you. As if Ishmael's enough, you can just use him. You don't have to go to these extreme lengths. How about Ishmael? Verse 19. But God said, no. It's pretty simple, isn't it? You've had a request. The answer is no. No, but Sarah, your wife, will bear you a son, once again, and you shall call his name Isaac, which of course means he laughs. And I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant for his descendants after him. What else do you learn in verse 19? Not only is there going to be a son named Isaac, what else is promised? Establish a covenant, and there's going to be descendants after him. So you realize this is not just going to be one generation. This is going to be multi-generational, especially when he says everlasting covenant, which tells you it's going to be far ongoing. Then, verse 21. But my covenant I will establish with Isaac, whom Sarah will bear to you at this season next year. When he finished talking with him, God went up from Abraham. Once again, what do you see God emphasize? Sarah is going to have a son, and his name is Isaac. I'm going to bless him. My covenant's going to be established with him and with his descendants after him. This will be an everlasting covenant. Now, you see these promises as they're given. And notice, these promises were given when Abraham is 99 years old. He sees, look over in chapter 21, Genesis 21. Look at verse 9. Remember this from 2 weeks ago. Genesis 21, verse 9. Now Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, mocking. Therefore she said to Abraham, drive out this maid and her son, of course being Ishmael, for the son of this maid shall not be an heir with my son Isaac. He says, he's not going to be an heir alongside, a fellow heir with my son Isaac. Verse 11, the matter distressed Abraham greatly because of his son. He loved Ishmael. Verse 12, but God said to Abraham, do not be distressed because of the lad and your maid. Whatever Sarah tells you, listen to her, for through Isaac your descendants shall be named. And once again, you see in this promise, it's through Isaac that your descendants are going to be named. Now, we already know what's coming next in terms of Isaac's going to have 2 sons, Jacob and Esau. Jacob's name is going to be changed by God to Israel. So God's people are going to take on a new name. Then, you see these promises given multiple times in terms of you're going to have a son, Abraham, going to come through Sarah. The son's name is going to be Isaac. There's going to be descendants that come after Isaac. You know all these things coming together into chapter 22. So now whenever you get to chapter 22, we kind of get a little bit of the backstory to make sure we remember what all did Abraham know for certain. Now, Isaac's already been born. He was already born of Sarah. He already knows there's going to be descendants that come through Isaac. He knows there's going to be a name that comes later on through Isaac. You come to chapter 22, verse 1, and this is how it starts. Now it came about after these days that God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham. And he said, here I am. What is God about to do? He's going to test Abraham. Now, let me ask this question. Hope I don't get in trouble. Why do middle school, high school, and college teachers give their students tests? To see what they know? If they've been learning, right? The teachers go through, they teach the principles of a subject matter, they reiterate those things, they reaffirm them in the students' learning, and then test day comes and it's time to figure out, can you recall these things and apply them? Right? Now, it's not as if, well, hopefully you never had a teacher like this. You go, teacher trying to trip up the kids on the test. Hopefully not. Realize with this, here's God saying, I'm going to test Abraham. Is he tempting Abraham? No, because God doesn't tempt anyone. He's not tempted by evil. Over in James chapter 1, verse 13. But here's what's being put in front of Abraham, an opportunity to succeed. And whenever God calls out to Abraham, what's his response? Here I am. I'm attentive. I'm ready to listen. You called my name. Here I am. Verse 2. He said, take now your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I will tell you. Think of all the things that Abraham has learned through these years in serving God. Throughout the decades that God has had this relationship with Abraham, and Abraham with God by faith, now it's time. Are you ready to respond out of the promises that I've given you? I've told you some things. Covenant promises, things of what's going to happen, and now let's see if we're going to apply them out of faith. Here in verse 2, he says, take your son, your only son, whom you love, and he specifically points out who? Isaac, as if there was a question. You don't have to go down to the wilderness of Paran and try and find Ishmael. He says, Isaac, he says, go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering. What did a burnt offering say to God? Yeah, God, I give you all of me. Later on, when you get to Leviticus chapter 1, it's going to describe the burnt offering in far more kind of an expanded idea. Specifically, what would happen when you get to Leviticus 1 for a burnt offering is the worshiper, and it's a voluntary offering. It's a worship offering. You would bring the animal. The worshiper would put his hand on the head of the animal. And all of a sudden now the animal stands in your place. And so now you're going to kill the animal. And you think about this, if the animal stands in your place and you're going to kill the animal, what are you saying about your will? I'm not going to do what I want. I'm totally dedicated to you. And then you would skin the animal because burnt hair never smells good. And then you would take you would take a portion of the animal, almost all of it, and you would put it up on the altar. A total sacrifice to God, saying, God, I'm completely and totally dedicated to you. And this is something that you would voluntarily do. There were other times where it was commanded as part of other things. But in the end, what does a burnt offering turn into? Turns into smoke before God, and the animal itself turns into what on the altar? Just a bunch of ash, right? So, here's Abraham hearing what God commands. I'm to take Isaac, I'm to go to the land of Moriah, and I'm to offer him up as a burnt offering. Total dedication to God. Now, I don't know if you have had moments like this in your life where you know and understand the command, but you're rather foggy on the purpose. Have you ever had moments like that? You know what God commands, but you're not quite sure why is this the way it's supposed to be? And I want to kind of pose a question to you. What do you do when God doesn't make sense to you? When you look at his commands and he tells you to love your enemy, and you know how terrible your enemy is, we go, I know the command, I don't quite understand the purpose. In terms of even forgiving people who have wronged you in a mighty way. I know the command. I don't understand the purpose here. And so often we find ourselves looking at the commandments of God and going, I understand what he's saying. How are we supposed to respond when we meet up with those kind of moments? I think we'll find our answer here with Abraham. Notice how it continues here. Look at verse 3. So Abraham rose early in the morning and saddled his donkey and took 2 of his young men with him and Isaac his son, and he split wood for the burnt offering and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. What do you notice that Abraham does? Does he drag his feet? Does he decide, it's not until I really figure out what the whole purpose of this is before I'm ever going to step out and be obedient? How many of us have ever sat in that camp? I'm not really going to do what God says until I understand the purpose. Is that really faith? No, that's not faith at all. That's saying I'm putting faith in my understanding. How are we in comparison to God? Not even close. Now, I want you to recall something. Look back at Genesis 18, verse 27. If you remember, whenever Abraham's been told by these 3 angels in the form of men who have come to him, telling him about the destruction of Sodom, and at this point in time, God's already told him, the Lord's told him, He says, if there's 50 righteous in Sodom, I won't destroy it. I want you to notice verse 27. And Abraham replied, now behold, I have ventured to speak to the Lord, although I am but dust and ashes. Did Abraham have an understanding of where he came from and what he was? He says, I'm just a bunch of dust and ashes. And so whenever you think about being commanded to offer up Isaac as a burnt offering, in the end, Isaac is going to be just a bunch of dust and ashes. Now, Abraham takes this command of God, and he doesn't drag his feet. He gets up early in the morning, and it talks about he saddled his donkey, he took 2 of his young men with him, has Isaac his son, and what else does he do? He splits wood. Now, isn't that something for you? He's over 100 years old. I guess you never get too old. But at the same time, here he is doing this. Why? What's he doing? He's preparing, right? When you think in terms of the commandments that we've been given about being patient with people, being kind with people, being gentle with people, do you ever split your wood early? And try and go ahead and prepare on how you're gonna be ready for these situations when they come? Job did. He even offered up sacrifices for his children, just in case they might have sinned. And I'm using that in a proverbial way, of course. But when you see the commandments of God, do we go, how can I prepare myself to keep this command? How can I learn how to love like Jesus does? Now, you notice here too, he says he split wood for the burnt offering. You think, well, he could have done that later. You see how he's doing everything on the front end that he can? Is that the way we see keeping God's commands? Then he says, and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. So he gets out to go to this place, verse 4. On the 3rd day, Abraham raised his eyes and saw the place from a distance. Now notice, how long of a journey is this so far? This is the 3rd day. How many trips have you been on where it took you 3 days to get where you were going? All right, they're walking, but let's just put it in terms of 3 days. You've been in a car for 3 days? That's a long ways, right? Maybe you get on an airplane and go somewhere, and then you have to drive an additional. Is 3 days kind of a long journey? And he's doing this just for what reason? To obey God's command. Now, think about how far and how much effort he's having to put into this. So here he is, the 3rd day, verse 5. Abraham said to his young men, stay here with the donkey, and I and the lad will go over there, and we will worship and return to you. Now, he gets to this point, he tells these 2 young men who've come with him, you just stay here with the donkey. Can you understand why he leaves them behind? It makes sense, doesn't it? They might try and stand in the way. Who knows? But then he says, I and the lad will go over there. You remember in the previous chapter where it talked about Ishmael being a lad and a boy? Remember what age he was? 15, 16 years old, a young teenager. It doesn't ever tell us a specific age for Abraham or Isaac in this chapter, but using this kind of terminology, if it's consistent with the previous chapters, Isaac may be a teenager at this point. We don't know. But here's something else. Look at the statement Abraham makes to these 2 servants. He says, stay here with the donkey, and I and the lad will go over there, and we will worship and return to you. What is a burnt offering? It's worship. It's worship. And then in English, there's an inferred pronoun here before return, what is it? We. Now, I know we look at that, well, you know, in English you can have some different things. In the Hebrew language, it's specifically a we. It goes out of its way to say, we will go worship and we will return, which goes ahead and tells you something about the mindset of Abraham. Does he have faith? What does he know about the promises that God has given him? What is coming through Isaac? Descendants. And they're going to come through this Isaac. And so what does Abraham know by faith in trusting God's promises?
God will save Isaac.
Isaac is going to be alive when we get back, which is quite something, isn't it? Because how many resurrection stories are there before this? 0. You notice what faith is doing. Now, we know the opposite of faith. Worry and anxiety come up with every worst-case scenario you can come up with. Faith, on the other hand, does what? I don't know how God's going to keep this promise, but there's something I know for sure. He's going to. Now, let's go over to the New Testament and find the mindset. Look over at Hebrews chapter 11. I'm sure you knew we were coming here. Hebrews chapter 11. Look down at verse 17. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 17. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, notice he uses that same word again, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises was offering up his only begotten son. Now you may already know how Genesis 22 goes. Is he literally going to offer up Isaac? Look at the way it's counted here in Hebrews. We'll deal with this later. We're just planting a seed. It says here, by faith Abraham offered up Isaac. He says, and he who had received the promises was offering up his only begotten son. Had received. Had God already shown that he would fulfill promises for Abraham? Did Sarah have a child? Did she have a son? Did they name him Isaac? Did they have all the descendants? Not yet. Notice how it continues, verse 18. It will be to whom it was said, in Isaac your descendants shall be called. Now, this is a quotation out of Genesis 21, verse 12, specifically reminding, it's in Isaac your descendants are going to be called. Not Ishmael, not some other descendant of yours. It's going to come specifically through Isaac. And then next comes just a beautiful, beautiful thing. Verse 19. Abraham considered that God is able to raise people even from the dead, from which he also received him back as a type. Now you know Abraham's mindset as we read through the rest of Genesis 22. He knows God has called him to offer Isaac up as a burnt offering. Abraham knows that in the end, his son is going to be the equivalent of what we think of as someone who's cremated. Does Abraham have a faith response to the promises of God? He's already told those two who are waiting with the donkey, we are going to go worship, and we will return. And now you know exactly what he was thinking. God's going to raise my son up from the dead of Ash. Did he know he was dealing with El Shaddai? Dealing with the God who keeps powerfully his promises? He promised me that I would have descendants through Isaac. And there's not even one yet. I know God will keep his promise. How do we get that faith in our heart. We're going to have to be people who, number one, know the promises of God that He's given, specifically for us in Jesus. And then what are we going to have to do with them? Trust them beyond anything you have ever seen or imagined. Had Abraham ever seen dust and ash raised to life? No, but did he know the promise of God? Yes. When we start to look at the promises of God as it is impossible for them not to be kept, that's where our lives are going to change. Because it's not about finding the ways that it can go wrong. It's about trying to imagine the ways that it must go right. Does that mean we always get healed from the sickness? No. We haven't been promised to stay here on earth forever. Thank the Lord. But you understand, Abraham is looking at the promises of God more than he's looking at any circumstance, any physical limitation, anything along those lines. It almost seems like from what's here and what he told those two men who are waiting by the donkey, that Abraham is going to offer up his son Isaac with the wood that he split 3 days ago. And after he is burned and charred and turned into just nothing but cremated ashes, it's as if Abraham expects to sit there and wait for God to raise him up from the dead. Now, come back to Genesis 22. Ron, do you have something you want to share?
Isn't that the epitome of free will?
Epitome of free will, that's right. You get to decide.
Isaac could have refused.
We'll see about that here in a second. Genesis 22. So he's made his statement here in verse 5. He says, we'll go over there, we will worship and return to you. Verse 6. Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son. And you just kind of, in my mind, I imagine Isaac carrying this wood. And remember, it's on a mountain. So guess the direction this thing goes. Uphill all the way. So, he says, laid it on Isaac his son, and he took in his hand the fire and the knife. So the two of them walked on together. Now you imagine, here's Abraham, knife in one hand, fire in the other. I don't know if it's a torch or if it's a way to make fire, whatever. And here they are walking along. Isaac carrying the split wood. You think they're glad they split it before they left home? Didn't have to bring an axe with them, I guess. So here they come, and as they're walking, verse 7, Isaac spoke to Abraham his father and said, "My father." And he said, "Here I am, my son." And he said, "Behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Is Isaac keen enough to know that they're going to offer a burnt offering? Apparently, have they offered a burnt offering often enough to where Isaac realizes the missing piece? He says, we have wood, we have fire, we have the knife to kill the offering. Something's missing. And look, you already know Abraham's mindset. And he's not ready to let everything out just yet. And you realize, too, has Abraham told Isaac what this trip's all about yet? No. Verse 8. Abraham said, "God will provide for himself the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." So the two of them walked on together. Was that answer sufficient for Isaac?
Apparently so.
Apparently so. He doesn't ask a follow-up like, well, when do you think he's going to provide it? He says, God will provide for himself the lamb for the burnt offering. Is Abraham trusting God? Yes. And yet at the same time, he hasn't revealed to Isaac what's about to happen either. I don't know if you ever feel like situations where you don't understand everything that's going on. And yet what is God still expecting of us? Faithful obedience. Now, once again, does Abraham know everything that's going to happen here? No. He knows what God promised. He knows that there has to be an outcome where Isaac's going to have to come to life to have descendants. What's going to happen here in between? I'm just going to have to obey and trust. And oh, that we would see the commandments of God that way. To where we get to the point of faith to say, I don't have to understand how it all turns out with these relationships. It's my responsibility to walk by faith and to keep them. And just let God take care of that. And let your imagination go wild in the faithfulness of God. He's worthy of it. He is the El Shaddai. Chuck.
As we can see from Abraham's thoughts, I mean, because of the gravity of the situation, he thought of a lot of different possibilities.
A lot of different possibilities. That's right. That's right. You see what he's already thinking of. The two of them walked on together, verse 9. Then they came to the place of which God had told him, and Abraham built the altar there and arranged the wood. And notice the next statement, and bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Builds the altar. Here they are on the mountain that God told them, the very place specifically. Arrange the wood, and he ties up Isaac. And this is no laughing matter. He says, and he laid him on the altar. Now you imagine, it tells you a little something about Abraham too. He's over 100 years old. I mean, whatever year that you imagine Isaac to be in age, Abraham's 100 years ahead of that. And picking up this lad and putting him on the altar and tying him up. This is quite a moment in time. Then he says, on top of the wood, verse 10, Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. If you were commanded by God to slay one of your children, if you have a son, imagine a son. If you only have daughters, think of that way. You know what you have to do. How would you proceed? What kind of speed do you want this to be met with? Do you want slow and agonizing? Or do you want this to be as quick as possible? It's hard to even put ourselves in this picture, isn't it? And yet at the same time, to think your way through that of going, I wonder if Abraham had been considering that as they climbed up. How's this going to go? And how quickly can this happen? Where's the best place to cut? You notice the moment in time, it talks about Abraham stretched out his hand. I kind of wondered if he sharpened the knife before he left. It doesn't say that, I know. It talks about Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. And you think how quickly he must have wanted this to go. Verse 11. But the angel of the Lord, covenant God, called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he didn't say, hold on, let me finish first. Here I am. I'm right here. Is he ready to listen? how much would you want to listen in that moment? Whenever you think about the attentiveness of Abraham in this moment, that is the type of attentiveness we should have with every word of God. As if our life or the life of one of our loved ones depends on it. Because it really does for ourselves. He says, here I am, verse 12. He said, do not stretch out your hand against the lad and do nothing to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. You talk about a sigh of relief. Now, I wonder if there was sweat on his brow in the moment. He says, do not stretch out your hand against the lad. Do nothing to him. Don't harm him. Diane. We'll find out shortly. Let's keep going. Good question, though. Then, he says, for now I know that you fear God. Is it as if God didn't know? He said, you haven't had an opportunity like this. It's nothing like whenever that student steps into the test and they pass it with 100%. He says, now it's been tested and now it's known. I knew you'd do it. Now, he says, now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Remember Jesus' words? Unless you love me more than father, mother, son, brother, goes down through all the family relatives. He says, unless you love me more than them, he says, you're not worthy of me. Is Abraham worthy of God? In this moment, in putting his son in the right place, he is, for sure. Now, he says, you fear me more than you feared taking your son's life. And by the way, when you get later on into Deuteronomy 12, toward the end of the chapter, it talks specifically about how that the children of Israel were to destroy the Canaanites in the land because guess what they were doing? They were worshiping their gods and they were offering up even their own children. He says, you have nothing to do with that. Is God ever going to demand a human sacrifice in terms of like this? No. With Jesus, there's the one and only.
But isn't this also kind of like looking toward Jesus?
Definitely looking toward Jesus, but there's one big difference you might be thinking. Notice, what is Isaac being offered up as? A burnt offering. Jesus is being offered up as a sin offering, a peace offering, a guilt offering, a grain offering, burnt offering, all those things together. But his death is about the sin offering. Joe. In terms of, Jesus said, you're not worthy of me unless you put me ahead of all the family. In that aspect, that's what I'm talking about. Not in terms of equality with God. Okay.
God always knew from eternity that here in physical time, here comes the reason he knew ahead of time.
Right.
But here's the thing that he always knew.
Right. And now here it is playing out, for sure, for sure. Notice how this continues on. Verse 13. Then Abraham raised his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him a ram caught in the thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered him up for a burnt offering in the place of his son. Remember what it said over in Hebrews 11? He says he offered his son. There's a stand-in, and is that suitable? Boy, are we glad. Who's our stand-in? Jesus. So you see what's going on. Notice once again, whenever he's not going to have to slay his son, then he looks around. He sees this ram caught in the thicket by its horns. Then, take in the place. Verse 14. Abraham called the name of that place, the Lord will provide, as it is said to this day, in the mount of the Lord it will be provided. If you remember, this is Mount Moriah. Take a little footnote. 2 Chronicles chapter 3, verse 1. This is the exact same place that the Temple of Solomon is going to be built. There's a reason God chose this place for this event to take place. So keep that in mind. Also the same place is where David was going to make an offering at the threshing floor of Araunah. Verse 15. Then the angel of the Lord, covenant God, called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, by myself I have sworn. How more sure can you be? I swear by myself. He says, declares the Lord, because you have done this thing and have not withheld your son, your only son, indeed I will greatly bless you, and I will greatly multiply your seed as the stars of the heavens. Have we seen a promise before about the stars of the heavens? Certainly with Abraham. He says, and as the sand which is on the seashore. Have we seen that illustration used before in Genesis? The correct answer is no. You have not. This now you have. So, real quickly, he says, and your seed shall possess the gate of their enemies. In your seed, talking about later on, this is prophecy about Jesus, all the nations of the earth shall be blessed because you have obeyed my voice. Galatians 3:8 quotes this, specifically about Jesus. Verse 19, so Abraham returned to his young men, and Isaac's right there with him, and they arose and went together to Beersheba, and Abraham lived at Beersheba. Goes right back to where they were before, where they were living. What an event. And understand, what do you do when you don't know and understand what God is saying and it doesn't make sense? Obey by faith and entrust your life to Him. All right. Lord willing, come back next week. We'll finish up chapter 22.